Hi, all. This is the third installment now in our history of English. And remember, previously I explained that English is actually a Germanic language. That means it's a part of a group of Germanic languages that all developed from an ancestor called Proto-Germanic, which was itself one of the branches of Indo-European. So the people who spoke Proto-Germanic, they would have been a group of Indo-Europeans who traveled to and settled in Northern Europe, and they kind of developed their own language there. But then later on, they spread out, and then lots of other languages developed from Proto-Germanic, which again, we refer to them all as Germanic. And so with this lecture, we're just going to talk a little bit more about the nature of this Germanic branch that English is part of. So first of all, when the Germanic group spread out and broke up, kind of migrated in different directions, they broke up into three main groups, three main categories. There are West Germanic dialects that come from Proto-Germanic, and English is part of this West Germanic group, also German and Dutch and Flemish. They're all more Western. And then there was a Northern group, so there are North Germanic dialects, and the Scandinavian languages belong in this group, so Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish. And then there was also an East group, a third group, and there are no modern languages that exist anymore from the East Germanic group, but we do have writings, some parts of the Bible that were written in Gothic, which was an Eastern Germanic language. So this is kind of the basic structure of the Germanic family. Now, I want to look at a key feature of this Germanic family. Notice that, and there's an outline for this now that you're going to want to have. It's a 2-page outline, and I'm kind of taking you through this, and it has a lot of material on it, and these slides are going to explain to you what this outline means. So make sure that you have the outline that is kind of English and Proto-Germanic. There's a link to it on the syllabus. So when we look at these different Germanic languages, what I've done here is I've shown you different words for father in the Germanic languages. And when we look at them, what we can see is that all the different Germanic languages, all the different Germanic words for father begin with an F sound. So based on that, we can say that, well, the Proto-Germanic word for father must have started with an F. And it's reconstructed something like this, Vater, with an F, and then with this theta here indicating a kind of a TH sound. However, remember, the Proto-Indo-European word for father started with a P, right? We reconstructed the IE Indo-European word for father, and it actually started with a P on a previous outline. So you might ask, what happened? How did this happen? How did this difference happen? Well, the answer is there was a sound shift. There was a general change in the pronunciation of a sound or a class of sounds that occurred during a particular period in the history of a language. In this case, this occurred during some period in the history of Proto-Germanic. And you can remember, if you want to review what a sound shift is, you can look at that phonology outline. So basically what I'm saying happened is that in Proto-Germanic, in PG, right, Proto-Germanic, there was a sound shift where these Germans, when they were living up there in Northern Europe somewhere, they started pronouncing P as F. And notice you can also see that they started pronouncing a T as a th. So that's a little more complicated, and we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to concentrate on the fact that P changed to F. So that instead of pater, you now had father. Now notice this shift that I'm talking about in Proto-Germanic did not occur in any of the other Indo-European branches. And you can see this if you look at the bottom of the outline. So on the left side, I've given you the Germanic words for father that start with F. And then I've shown you Latin and Greek and Sanskrit. All those languages, the word for father starts with a P, right? So there we can see that, yeah, the Proto-Indo-European word was P, started with a P, and these other languages, they kept that P. But for some reason, the Proto-Germans started pronouncing their P's as F's. And now notice, furthermore, if you go on to page 2 of the outline, there you can see that these are just some samples, that the P's changed to F's in other words as well. And in fact, what we can see is that by comparing different Germanic languages, we can see that in Proto-Germanic, this shift must have occurred for almost all P's. That is, all P's they started pronouncing all their P's as F's, except in certain special conditions. But notice, again, if you look at the top of page 2, on the left side, we see 3 different words for foot that come from Germanic. But then look at the Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit words. They all start with P. Those are the words for foot in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. Or the Germanic word for fire starts with an F, but then, well, I only have the Greek one, but you can see the word for fire in Greek starts with a P, right? So again, from this, we can see that in Proto-Germanic, for some reason, we can't explain why, we don't know why they did this, but we can see that they had a general sound shift where they started pronouncing almost all their P's as F's. And in fact, also, if you look further along on page 2, you'll see that other sound shifts occurred as well. So these Germans, they changed their pronunciation of other consonants also. So that the K sound came to be pronounced as an H. So that's why we have the word heart in English, which is the same as Greek cardia and Latin cord. And then D's came to be pronounced as T's, so that the Latin word for two is duo, but of course in English we say we have a T, two. Or the word for our word for tooth starts with a T, but in other languages it starts with a D. So again, that shows that the Germans, these Proto-Germans, started pronouncing their D's as T's. And then, notice that we have words that start with K, but that K came from an original G, a G sound, right? So in the word for knee, or in the word for kin, right? So the word for kin is cognate with the Latin word genos and the Greek word genos, which we saw as gen is the base that we've just learned, starting with a G. And it's cognate. It goes back to the same root as the word kin, but the Germans started pronouncing their G as a K. And then the word for brother, these words that begin with B, they also go back to a different sound that was shifted to B. Okay. Now notice that so there's a whole series of shifts then that occurred here. And all of these shifts must have occurred way back in time, way back when the Proto-Germans were still kind of together as a group, because that's the only way to explain that all the different German languages have this shift, right? It's much more likely that it occurred first and then they spread out, and so all of them had that shift. It's much more likely that happened instead of they spread out first and then all the different groups, for some reason, accidentally all started making the same shift. Okay. All right, so what we see here from this evidence is that there's a whole series of shifts. And if you look down at the bottom half of page 2, you'll see that I have these shifts organized into a kind of a structure where I have the IE sound, the Indo-European sound, on the left, and then what it shifted to in Proto-Germanic. And so you can see that there's a whole structure or pattern to these shifts. And we call this structure or this pattern of shifts Grimm's law. The reason why we call it that is because Jacob Grimm, the famous one of Grimm's fairy tales, discovered this, or he described this whole series of shifts. He could see that, P became F, and also T became Th, and K became H. And so in fact, there's a pattern to this. If you go back and look at that phonology outline, you'll see that P, T, and K are all voiceless consonants. They're in the same column, and they all shifted over to become fricatives. Th, Th, K. Notice that they're still pronounced in the same part of the mouth, but they just shift to become a different kind of sound. And then the same thing happened here with the second part of Grimm's law, B, D, and G, where they were all voiced, right? They belong in that voiced column, and they just lost their voices, right? So B became P, and D became T, and G became K. And then finally, the third part is a little bit different. There was an Indo-European consonant that was voiced and also aspirated that we don't really use, and it doesn't generally occur very often. And in this case, the aspiration was just lost, right? So that you just ended up with a B and a D and a G. Notice that the only place where you still see, if you look back up at the top half of the outline here, you'll see the only place where you still see a BH is in Sanskrit, bratar, the word for brother, whereas that BH changed to other sounds in both Latin and Greek. So that's Grimm's law. And then a key point of Grimm's law is that what Grimm's law does for us is it explains why words that are in Germanic languages, including English, look so different from words in other Indo-European languages, even though they're related, even though they're cognates, they go back to exactly the same root. And so based on this, now we can ask a question about English vocabulary in general, which is very pertinent to us, relevant to this class. Explain why English vocabulary contains the word father, but it also contains the word paternal, which is cognate with it. It goes back to the same original root. English contains fire, but it also contains pyre, heart and cordial, know and agnostic. And of course, you've learned that element that know means to know. So they're really the same word and they look very similar. They go back to the same root. So how can English contain both of these two very different looking cognates? Well, the simple answer is words like paternal and agnostic that contain the original IE consonants have been adopted from other languages, usually from Greek or Latin. Right? So paternal actually comes from Latin and agnostic comes from Greek. In Greek and Latin, those sound shifts didn't occur. Greek and Latin didn't shift their P's or their G's. And so words that contain these original IE consonants, like P and G, that go back to their original Indo-European root, those must be loan words in English, right? They're words that were adopted or taken over from some other language. But words like fatherly and know, right, with a F and a K, must in fact be Germanic words, right? They are words that are native to English, that are kind of part of the English language, and they've developed in English from Proto-Germanic and on into English. They're not borrowed or adopted from some other language. Notice that even though K is silent in the word know, originally it was pronounced. So these silent letters, they're not pronounced now because they're kind of difficult to pronounce, but originally it was kno, right? Which is very similar to gno. It's just that the G has shifted to a K in this Germanic word that's in English. Okay, so that's it for English and Proto-Germanic and Grimm's law. So make sure you understand all that, and let me know if you have any questions about it. Bye-bye.